when I sat in some of my master's MSc classes in International Rural Development Planning, we spent a lot of time, class after class, defining development, defining planning, defining rural, and often I would roll my eyes and say, let's just get on with it. If you're feeling that same way now, I sympathize, because I felt that way myself at times. But I think the time spent thinking a bit about the definition of what we mean by resilience is important, partly because in the development and the DRR communities, it's still a new concept and we're still thinking it through. Some of the thinking on resilience, as it's being applied in development and DRR, has come from a different field. It's come from ecology, where the resilience that is being talked about is the resilience of an ecosystem, or as it was often come to be discussed and understood, the resilience of a social ecological system, a coupled system where the social and ecological are integrally linked in a single system. This is a typical definition coming from that literature: the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, and identity. So what's resilient is a system. What you may notice in this definition is that there's nothing inherently normatively positive in that definition. System can be resilient and yet undesirable. Now, in these kinds of forums, the example I typically hear is poverty traps, and that's a good example. But that's a fairly obvious example. Even in cases where the resilience of that system is positive at one time, when the opportunities change, you may reach a point where, okay, well, that system was nice for a while, but now, if we want to take this, say, for example, a traditional pastoralist system, we now have an opportunity to transform it. It will look something like traditional pastoralism looked before, but it may have fundamental differences in their function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. So whether or not a resilient system is desirable or not is actually, it's more complex than just finding a negative example of resilience like poverty traps and a positive example. And in fact, there may be more than two possibilities. In the development and DRR communities, there's a bit of convergence now over the past couple of years. There isn't an agreed upon definition, but there is a fair degree of convergence around definitions such as this: the ability of a household to keep with a certain level of well-being, for example, being food secure, by withstanding shocks and stresses. And here's another one: the capacity to cope with adverse stressors or shocks without adverse development consequences. So again, in both of these definitions, well-being is at the center of it. And what you want to be resilient is that well-being over the long term. Now, the humanitarian relief and the DRR communities are emphasizing maintaining well-being in the fairly short term in the face of shocks and stresses, whereas the development community is emphasizing improving well-being over the long term. But the resilience concept is providing some intellectual tools to help bridge that gap between development and DRR, and what's common between them, again, is this emphasis on well-being. So, I mean, I don't think I need to talk much about the need for measuring what some of us are calling development resilience. In the paper that we've written that's coming out soon, I hope, we refer to it as development process resilience. But we're interested in building resilience, building this normative kind of resilience that relates to maintaining and continuing to improve well-being over the long term, and we want to be able to measure impact. Some key principles. I phrase some of these a bit differently than Katie, but I think we're more or less talking about the same thing. First of all, in terms of impact assessment, we want to distinguish the outcomes of resilience, or perhaps I should use the word impacts here. The impact of if a household or a community or a region or an economy is resilient, what will you see that's different? What will be the outcomes and impacts of that? And on the other hand, what are the determinants? What were the characteristics and relationships that allowed that to happen? Now, if you're observing resilience outcome indicators, and you're seeing that they're different from one village to another or different from one region to another, you also need to understand a little bit about the severity of the shocks. If community A responded better to the drought than community B, was that because community A was more resilient, or was that because the drought was actually more severe over at community B? So that's another category of indicators we need to look at. Another principle here, development resilience is not simply the inverse of vulnerability, it's not simply coping with shocks. If we want this development resilience concept to be a pro-poor concept, then coping with shocks is important, it's vitally important, but it's not enough. And then the third principle that we're trying to deal with as we work this through is the need for finding a balance between having more and better data on the wide array of possibilities, of factors that are involved, versus the need for economy and realism in terms of what realistically can we expect to be gathered consistently over a long term, what's affordable, and so on. So with those principles in mind, we need indicators, and so I've started to discuss this already. We need indicators of the state of human development, and if we're defining resilience as relating to well-being in a normative sense, then those impact indicators are indicators of well-being and their changes over time. We also need indicators of the extent and severity of shocks, and Mohammed will talk a bit about some methods for doing that for drought. And then we need indicators of the broader social ecological conditions. The focus of my work in this area over the past few months has been on the first of these categories, the impact indicators. And essentially what we're looking at here is if the y-axis here is either a particular indicator of well-being or some kind of index along the same lines as the Human Development Index, what we want to know is how do those well-being indicators respond to a shock? How do they respond to a drought, for example? Now, what we don't mean, and I don't think we want to let development resilience come to mean, is this. If the red line is a threshold of poverty or a threshold of well-being below which we find to be unacceptable, then in one way of conceiving of resilience, a household or a community that's characterized by that blue line over time, a drought hits, and they recover, but they're still below the poverty line. If development resilience is to be a pro-poor concept, if it's to relate to well-being over the long term, then what we differentiate ourselves from the system resilience kind of perspective is that what we want to be resilience is not the household as a system, it's not the state of the household or a community before and after, it's the resilience of a development process. And by the development process, I mean the process of improving human capabilities and well-being over time. It's about that trajectory. We need the trajectory, the upward trajectory, to be resilient. So for impact indicators, just as to do a very rough sort of back of the envelope test, we gathered some data from nutrition surveys in northern Kenya. This is from Marsabit County, and we traced them over time in relation to droughts. And now this is not well-being, this is reversed. So this is the malnutrition, the incidence of acute malnutrition is going up. So it's reversed from a well-being. But so in this case, in the early 2000s in Marsabit, you had malnutrition worsening for a time, but then it leveled off and the situation started to improve. It came down, then a drought hit, and the rate of improvement slowed. I should come over here since I don't have it right. The rate of improvement slowed, a second drought hit, and so malnutrition started to go up again. But by the time that drought was finished, malnutrition started dropping again. Again, another drought, the rate of improvement slowed, and malnutrition shut up. Again, it came down. that's very rough. And I mean, we need to work towards more sophisticated analyses. Our point here is that what we need to look at, I forgot, I had this, I didn't need to come and point. And I spent a long time figuring out how to do that too. All right, so just to wrap up, in an abstract way, this is not a mathematical formula, it's just an abstract conceptualization. Development process resilience, we're suggesting, is a function of the impact indicators, the slope of a well-being trajectory after shock in relation to the slope of the well-being before the shock, modulated according to the severity of the shock, and that's determined by the things on the other side of the equation, a suite of factors that determine resilience. And to wrap up, although we're convinced that development resilience is different than the social ecological resilience, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The social ecological resilience thinking has had a lot of effort and good science that's gone into thinking through the complex dynamics of what resilience is, and there's a lot to borrow from there that so far in the resilience discourse, the development resilience discourse, I haven't seen. I'll flip through those without talking about them, and I better stop.